Before I start, I would like to say a few words of the structure of this presentation. I will start by describing the background for my and Alexandro's work. Then I will tell you about the model for recognition of prior learning that we developed. After that, I will tell you about the specific validation criteria that we have developed for the bachelor's degree in social work and the assessment matrix Alexandro, together with senior researchers at the department, are working on right now. I will say a few words about the applicant before I go into the problems. Which are the biggest obstacles for the recognition of prior learning? Last, I will share with you our ideas for future work to be able to finish our goals for validation of professional social workers. The bachelor degree in social work is a professional degree with a focus on professional social work. The program is 3.5 years long and compounds of compulsory courses within the field of social work. An internship is also included in the program. In Sweden, many professional social workers work at a social service department with social welfare benefits, which can be about paying social benefits to the needy and carrying out child care investigations when there is a suspicion that children are being abused. This can, for example, lead to that the social service forcibly place the child into care. This task is both difficult and requires a high degree of professionalism. The bachelor's degree in social work is required to work in the social services, child and youth care. The legislation came into effect on 1st of July 2014. There are transitional provisions that applies until last of June 2022. In many municipalities, there are several people working in the social services who do not have the right education. In 2016, a survey was conducted which showed that 7% of the social secretaries in the country were unqualified. That means about 350 people. In connection with the changed law, quite suddenly, there were many inquiries from people employed in the social work with, for example, a general degree in sociology or behavioral science. They wanted to get through with the validation process. Around the same time, the great wave of refugees came, and there were many suggestions of how people with a foreign degree could be validated. These included fast tracks and supplementary training. It started supplementary education for people with foreign education, but those with Swedish wrong education had no opportunity to easily complete their education to get the Bachelor of Science in Social Work. This is the reason why me and my colleague Alexandro began working on how we could validate people for a bachelor's degree in social work, regardless of where they came from and regardless of whether they had formal papers or not. Alexandro and I were granted funding from the Swedish Council of Higher Education to develop both a general model for recognition of prior learning and specific validation criteria for the bachelor's degree in social work. Our model. Sweden has 17 programs for the bachelor's degree in social work. The qualitative targets for the bachelor's degree in social work are stipulated in the Higher Education Ordinance. All bachelor programs in social work have a slightly different structure, but have the same degree objectives. The aim of the project was to find common national validation criteria. We started from the qualitative targets and grouped the learning outcomes of each course at our own program at Lund University in each degree objective. Then we had meetings with Director of Studies and study counselors at the universities in Gothenburg, Malmö, Stockholm, Umeå, and Lund. They gave feedback and we went back home, pondering and revised the criteria and went back to the 5 universities once again. We also conducted interviews with 15 professors on the subject. The interviews with the professors were an important part of our project. That is because social work is a relatively new academic subject in Sweden. The first professor in Sweden in social work was appointed in 1979. We therefore also wanted to get a definition of social work as both an academic subject and its theoretical basis, as well as a definition of professional social work. Among other things, we wanted to see how the subject differs from Sweden. What emerged in the interviews was, among other things, that professional social work in Sweden has its emphasis on the exercise of authority, unlike many countries where social work primarily moves in civil society and the qualitative targets. The goal of our project was to write national validation criteria for the bachelor's degree in social work. In Sweden, there are 17 higher education institutions that have the right to award degree in social work. The degree must be based on the degree objectives or qualitative targets that are described in Appendix 2 of the Higher Education Ordinance. The objectives are divided into knowledge and understanding, skills and abilities, and evaluation ability and approach. In order to achieve the goals, however, the 17 different higher education institutions have designed different courses with different learning outcomes. To filter out the validation criteria, we sorted the course objectives into each qualitative target. When we get into the validation criteria, I will use the example of how we worked with the qualitative target, show self-awareness and empathy. Based on the qualitative targets, the learning outcomes of each course, the input from the director of studies and study counselors from the other universities, and the interviews with the professors, we developed 30 validation criteria, which, according to the study, describe what competences a bachelor in social work is expected to have. Based on the example of qualitative targets show self-awareness and empathetic ability, we developed 2 validation criteria. Number 28, reflect on your own approach and your own professional role. And number 29, reflect on your own empathetic ability. There is ongoing work of how validation criteria will be assessed. Alexandra and the subject representatives at the department are currently working on an assessment matrix for each validation criteria. It is an ambitious work where we carefully go through what competences the applicant must have in order to be validated to each criteria. There will be a longer description of how to be assessed, an estimate of how long it takes to validate an applicant, who has the subject competence to carry out the assessment of each criteria, and in what way the knowledge if the applicant lacks documentation. The time aspect, how long the assessment of each criteria should take, in what way the assessment is made, on campus or remotely, internet-based, the area of questions that the validator should use in connection with each validation criteria. Will there be fact-based questions or will there be problematization of theories, for example? Requirement level, basic or in-depth knowledge. And most importantly, clarify the validator's scope for interpretation, which should be characterized by a generous and flexible approach in the assessment. According to the Swedish legislation, the person who wants a recognition of prior learning needs to be a student at the university. When a person applies for recognition of prior learning at the School of Social Work, they need to complete a form where they describe their prior learning relevant to our validation criteria. In addition, they need to attach all relevant documentation and/or a personal letter if they lack formal documentation. So, what we do when a person is interested in applying for recognition of prior learning is to give the applicant the 30 validation criteria and ask them to explain in which way they consider themselves to meet these requirements. And as well, you well know, it can be about formal, non-formal, or informal qualifications. I continue on the example of empathetic ability and the 2 validation criteria, number 28 and 29. The student completes a form where he/she describes his or her merits based on the 30 validation criteria. They can get some help from our description in the middle column. So here in the left-hand side column, we have the validation criteria. In the middle column, there is a short description of the criteria. In the right-hand side column, the applicant fill in his or her qualifications. Who carries out the validation? The applicant primarily has contact with the administrator at the department, who communicate how the processing will be carried out and what kind of documentation we will need. When the application has been received, we look at the documentation so it's complete and then send it on to the department's assessment group. Here, the assessment group divides the work based on their own competencies. They will be responsible for assessing a number of validation criteria. When the assessments are ready, the case goes back to the administrator, who writes a proposal for a decision. The matter is decided by the department board. So, now's the problems. We have an ambitious and comprehensive plan so that the validant is not counted as a second best bachelor of social work. If a person is validated equals to a bachelor in social work, we must be confident that the person has the same knowledge and skills as a person who has completed his or her entire education at a university in Sweden. This approach is also costly. It costs both time and money. Time for the applicant to complete the application and for us who will do the job because it's an extensive work. Money, especially for the university that loses the compensation for the student, but must work for free with the case. And still, the knowledge about validation in general is generally low at higher education institutions. An additional problem regarding time is that in order to start a case, the applicant must be a student. If the student then applies to the university and is admitted, it's just under a month from the applicant receiving an admission notice until the education starts, and we should have an assessment ready. That time range is too short. In the project, we have always strived for the validant to receive a bachelor's degree in social work after validation. This is so that the person can be accepted in the labor market. This will be possible in cases where the applicant has to complete his or her education with certain courses within the program, as the rest of the qualification will then be credited within the degree. If an applicant turns out to have all the skills we require, I don't know what kind of certificate that person can get. As far as I know, this has not yet been resolved. Future work. Alexandra and I have applied for funds to be able to continue the development of this project. What we would like to do is to link each criteria to a course so that even those who cannot be fully validated but lack certain knowledge and skills can complete their education with specific courses. It would mean 30 courses of varying scope but with a syllabus and learning outcome. Today, there are supplementary education for people with a foreign degree. We would like there to be also for those with Swedish educations and long work experience in professional social work. We also want the supplementary education to be individually adapted so that the student only needed to do the parts that he or she lacks. This would be socio-economically beneficial for both the applicant and the universities, would save both time and money. The applicant only needs to complete the courses he or she really lacks. We would like to see that most of these courses could be organized online, and if somebody wants to be validated, he or she can apply for supplementary education and start the right supplementation process immediately. We also need to establish a routine for handling cases. We have just started and need to find the right ways to handle matters as smoothly as possible. For the department, the assessment is a time-consuming process that, of course, cannot be done pro bono. We don't yet know how this will be financed. An important task is also to inform colleagues at our own department about recognition of prior learning, but also within the university and nationally. We don't have the answers to all the questions, but we also see that there is still a lot of ignorance about validation in general. For further reading about my and Alexandra's project on validation model and specific validation criteria for the bachelor's degree, the report is available for downloading. Unfortunately, it's just only published in Swedish, but I'm sure you will find a way to translate it if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. It's really interesting to hear how you've been working from the rather unspecified criteria on national level and getting them down to something which is possible to assess.